Hello again, everybody. It's Laurie White with the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to episode number 116 of Chamber TV. 116 episodes during the course of the last year. Hard to believe, and really want to thank all of our viewers, all of our listeners, all of our guests, and of course, Chamber staff for continuing to make this the place to turn for the latest in news and information and motivation and trends and stuff that you can use in your day-to-day business to be awesome. So we, as always, are live on Twitter, we are live on Facebook, and we are live on YouTube. And we welcome your comments, your suggestions, your questions. Just put them in the chat. We have a great conversation teed up for you today. It's something that's very timely, and no doubt something that has really gained a lot of traction over the course of the last several months during this pandemic, as life has switched to, increasingly digital, increasingly e-commerce driven, and the foundation of all these products is websites. So we're going to be talking about websites today and what really makes a good website, not just a good website, but a great website that delights people. The user experience is right on target, and it brings customers back over and over and over again to engage and to help drive the metrics of your own business. So really excited today to welcome Adam Olenn from Rustle Spark, and he is our special guest today and talking all things digital. How you doing today, Adam?
Very well, Laurie. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for stepping up and bringing this topic to our attention and providing the expertise that you have. So we, just before we were going live with the program, you and I had a chance to just chat a little bit about your business. And, I said, Rustle and Spark, those aren't names of people. They're nouns, they're verbs. They're meant to evoke a certain emotion. So tell us a little bit about your firm and how you got going and who, how you've been able to source talent.
Sure. So Rustle Spark is a full stack creative agency. The name is really a description of our process. If you want to get high quality creative, you need to work through a lot of different ideas. Good ones, bad ones, weird ones. That's the rustling. And when you rustle around in all those ideas, eventually the right thing sparks. And so that's where the name comes from. It really is sort of a description of the creative process and the way we approach our work. Sort of writ large, what is a strategic creative firm? The way we view it, that's a three-step process that is always brand, business, creative in that order. Brand is the soul of your organization. It's not the window dressing. It's actually who you are on the inside that drives everything else. Sometimes we're invited to brand a new company. Sometimes we're invited to rebrand an existing company that needs to sort of refocus who they are. Sometimes the brand's in great shape and we just say, okay, great, we understand it. And then we look at the business objectives with the client. Why did you call us? Are you trying to drive sales, increase top line revenue, deal with internal challenges, communications protocols? Once we know what the business objectives are and can prioritize them, and what the brand is that makes this company special in its ability to achieve them, then we can unroll the creative toolkit, whether that's logos or naming a company or a product line, building out websites, ongoing marketing that can take the form of blogs, podcasts, social media, filmmaking. And we like to use the word filmmaking rather than video, not because we're movie snobs, but because so much video ends up being really kind of an animated brochure where someone just kind of talks at you. But when you leverage the power of visual storytelling to influence people's emotions and beliefs and think like a filmmaker, as though you're approaching this like you're making a movie, you employ a whole lot more narrative structure and discipline that really delivers results in terms of how much people feel based on the piece that you've made and then the decisions they make because of those feelings.
Yeah, so you've touched on a really important concept there, and that is, how do you want people to feel when they interact with your brand or your company or your people? And that, oftentimes people kind of skip over that part, what does that mean? And how do I really, congeal all the aspects of my persona, all of the individuals with whom I do business, how to recreate a feeling. So when you're working with a firm, or you're looking at part of your work product, you feel empathy, I guess, is probably the best way to put it.
That is exactly the word. Exactly the word. It always starts there. If you want people to feel a certain way, you have to start with understanding how they feel now, and what is different. How might they feel that isn't the way they want to feel, and how can you help them get there? Good sales is helping.
Well, the other thing about filmmaking is, whether we know it or not, but subconsciously we all have an expectation in our brain of what we expect good visual content to look like, because we're exposed to it on a day-to-day basis when we're, watching TV or looking at websites or whatever. We know what good video or storytelling, visual storytelling looks like, and conversely, we know what bad storytelling and bad visuals, we know what that looks like too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think back, I remember when I was a kid, there were 5 channels. You had your 3 networks, and then the one channel that had cartoons after school, and the other channel that you could kind of sort of get if you held the bunny ears just right. And now, with the explosion of cable and streaming services and YouTube and what have you, there is so much content out there that it's not a good place to have weak content. You really have to make sure your storytelling game is sharp to be able to compete in that environment.
Yeah, so you're talking about the fragmentation of the audience and the need really today to use tools like websites and blogs and outbound social media tactics in order to bring people into your sphere, if you will, and to deliver something of value to them when they reach your website.
That's right. Yeah, exactly so.
And I have to point out that you're a bit of an expert in this in terms of filmmaking and creativity. We remember your Frozen rendition that that generated 1 million, 2 million, 10 million YouTube hits a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, that was an exciting time. I think it was 4.2 million on YouTube, total global media reach of 2 billion, and we got to have a couple of turns on Good Morning America, the Today Show, Access Hollywood. Definitely not places that you expect to end up when you are marketing a private school, but it was fun.
Yeah. Well, what we're talking about, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, Adam was with the Moses Brown School for a period of time, and decided he wanted to create a novel way of saying no school. So instead of just your, pedestrian sort of, guess what, no school today, it's snowing, Adam composed a very interesting way of communicating with parents and kids using the soundtrack from Frozen and substituting no school words in it, and put it out on YouTube. And it was a few years ago when this kind of thing was like super, super, out of the box and novel, and that's why it got so much traction all over the place, right?
Yeah, and it's the most rewarding part of that has been seeing the way that other folks have embraced that idea and made it their own. Really, for the 3 years following, basically every snowstorm, there would be a whole raft of different snow day videos from principals and superintendents and teachers and things like that. And to just see the whole educational community embrace the fun in those moments. When you're in education, you're helping children, and that should be fun.
Yeah, so I bring this up as a context for the discussion that we are going to start right now, because I just want to show to our folks that Adam has been there, he's been on the other side, he knows what it takes to come up with an out-of-the-box idea that gets eyeballs and has proven to be an expert at using various kinds of social media to deliver a very powerful message. So having laid the groundwork for all of this, Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin your presentation on specifically a deep dive into websites and what really makes a good website today from a visually compelling, content-driven perspective, but also hearkening to what we were just talking about, making people feel good about the experience of going to your site. So take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Laurie. So today we're talking about websites that work, strategies for sales success. The word sales is in there because most websites are sort of the front door of your store and are performing either a lead gen function or helping you get new leads to convert into the top of the funnel. It's certainly not the only thing that websites are for, though the majority of them fall into that category. The philosophies and approaches that we look at over the course of the next roughly hour will be applicable no matter what the business objective is that you're trying to reach. Next slide, please, Mike. So when I was at Moses Brown, as Laurie mentioned, one of the projects on my plate was a new school website. And the site we had wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. And as I looked around the rest of the industry, I didn't see really any others that were great. My career started actually building websites for Haagen-Dazs and Mercedes-Benz and Kellogg's and other Fortune 500 companies in the first wave of digital agencies down in Washington, D.C. And so this is something I've been doing for a long time, and I really have a passion for user interface. I hate those little moments of frustration in my day, and I have empathy for other people in their days. And so when I looked at all these school websites, none of them seemed to hit the mark, and it took me a long time to figure out why. But eventually it occurred to me. The problem was these websites were about these schools. Of course they were. They were the school websites. But the realization that changed everything for me was realizing that nobody cares about your school. They care about their kid. And if you think about what's on their mind and what's in their heart as they think about their child, suddenly that reframes everything you do online. Because even if they have 8 kids, there's one that made them just made both parents look at each other and say, there's got to be more for her, or there's more for him. More what? You don't necessarily know. More challenge, more support, whatever, but their mind is on the child. So what if you built a website that was all about the child and the child's experience rather than a map of your org chart? Now, it felt revolutionary at the time. Any salesperson will tell you that sales 101 is make it about the customer. So this is really about applying some timeless knowledge and discipline to the craft of making websites. Next slide, please, which we'll just pop right through. We've already covered the fact that I'm head of Rustle Spark. So how not to design a website. Hint, the way almost everyone does it. Next slide. How does everyone do it? First, they ask, what should be on our site? Then, next slide, they argue, where should things go? And then step 3, they settle onto something no one hates and no one loves. And that results in, next slide, sad users. Nobody wants sad users. We want a joyful, happy world, not a sad world. All right, next slide. So, do you want to know a better way? Yes. How does this happen? Well, let's look at the process, because it's not the fact that people aren't giving their all to make a great website. They are, but they're actually starting with a flawed process, and a flawed process will give you a flawed result. So next slide. The first question to ask about this process is who has their interests represented at the table? It is, of course, next, Your team. Oh, back up one. So when the team is sitting around the table having the conversation about what should be on our website, every business unit or every department, however you phrase them in your organization, has a really good case to make. And that is, look, if our department or our business unit is important enough to keep on payroll, with all these salaries and benefits and office space and computers and chairs, if it's worth having us around, aren't we part of the offering? And thus, shouldn't we be on the website? Well, that's a really good point. And that's a fair argument. And what's more, when you're having a conversation like that, the people at the table perceive a political disadvantage within the organization to not being included on the site. And they're correct in that. If that's the conversation and you're not part of it, you are at a political disadvantage within the organization. So there's a powerful motivation to advocate for being included on the site, on the homepage, in the navigation, that kind of thing. Next slide. You know who's not at that table having their interests represented? Next. Your customer. Oops. And that results in, of course, next, sad customers. We don't want sad customers. We want happy customers. So next, why does this work out so badly? Why does the customer end up sad when that's the process by which you drive your website development? Next, this is a great book, The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz, and this really explains the problem. When all these competing areas are advocating to be included, and they end up being included, right? You don't, more often than not, it's hard to cut and easy to include, and it certainly keeps the peace around the decision-making table. You end up with a lot of stuff on your site. Well, the more stuff you have on the site, the worse it is for the customer. The less likely they are to be able to make a decision, and you want them to make a decision. You put up this site so that they would do something. But the more options you confront them with, the harder it is for them to decide what to do. In this book, they talk about a famous study by Sheena Iyengar out at UC Irvine, where they went to a supermarket and they put out a little table with some different jars of jelly that you could buy, and some of them were open with some crackers, and so you could try. And there were 6 different jams that you could sample, some strawberry and some blueberry and some raspberry, nothing too wild. There were these 6 jams, and then you could buy them if you wanted to. Then they reran that, but instead of 6, they offered 32 options. They're catering to every taste there is. You like boysenberry? We got that. Fig? Absolutely. Rhubarb? Sure thing. So now your palette of choices has expanded dramatically. If you didn't like the 6 options that were there, it's almost certain you would like one of these 32. So by catering to people's tastes with 32 different choices, what happened to sales? No, they went down. Sales plummeted when they had 32 jams instead of 6. Why? Because between 6, you can make a choice. With 32, you end up, your brain locks up. And this one or that one or the other, you know what? I just have to keep shopping. I have to get home. And it takes, the decision-making becomes its own workload that is too much to carry through. That happens on websites all the time, especially when you have multiple departments saying we need to be on there, and you end up with crowded navigations. It's not uncommon when we redo a website for a client that we'll see navigations that might have 5 or 6 primary categories, each of which have 5 to sometimes even 10 elements in a drop-down list, which means your customer has to make a decision among 25 to 50 items to proceed further on your website. Obviously, with the lessons that we learned from the paradox of choice here, going from 6 to 32 crushes follow through. Imagine going up to 50. Nothing good happens there. Next slide. Okay, so what's the secret? There's all this information coming at us all day long, different websites. I heard something interesting just this morning about the invention of the telegraph. There was some concern about the ability of people sending telegrams, the telegram operators, to have a sense of what's going on, because there was a concern that there could be up to 200,000 messages a year sent with the telegram. And right now we send about that many messages an hour between social media and all the other different platforms. So there's an explosion of information, and we have to be able to figure out our way through it. And our websites have to guide people through that. In trying to figure out how to get through all that noise, I turn to the holy book, The Gospel of Curly. Next slide. What's the Gospel of Curly? Well, if you've ever seen City Slickers, you'll probably remember the moment where Billy Crystal and Jack Palance are riding down the old trail, and Jack Palance is this hard-bitten old cowboy named Curly, and he says, "You want to know the secret to life?" Billy Crystal says, "What? Your finger?" "No, one thing. Do one thing." Next slide. Here's a site that does one thing, and it does pretty well. At Amazon, you buy stuff. That's it. Find a thing and buy it. Now, they have almost everything there is you can buy, but the site itself does one job: help you find the thing and buy it. And they've made it incredibly smooth. If you've been there any number of times, they have a sense of what you like, what you've bought before. They often can serve up the right thing, even if you search the wrong way for it. You still will end up with the right product in front of you, and there's a button that says buy with one click. You don't even have to go to a shopping cart and whatnot. So in 2 clicks, you can go from "I think I want" to "it's in the mail, headed to you." Incredibly elegant, incredibly effective, and the financial results are obvious. Next slide, please. So what can we do about all of this? Well, fortunately, there's been a ton of research into the science and psychology of decision-making, and we can take advantage of that to shape experiences that help people take the actions and make the decisions that we want them to from a business perspective. Next. All right, so we're going to look at 5 important principles that will guide us through this. And those 5 principles will be followed by 5 techniques. So the principles are: use the availability heuristic, which I'll explain in a moment, meet their problem. 2, remember that recognition gives a pop of dopamine. It feels good emotionally when you find what you're looking for. 3, understand the neuroscience behind decision-making and the fact that emotions drive decisions. 4, use all that to make it about your customer. To Laurie's point, use empathy to get in their shoes, take on their perspective, and design to that. And 5th, whenever possible, cut. So next, the availability heuristic. What is it? Why is everyone driving your car? You buy a new car. Let's say you get a Jeep. All of a sudden, everybody's got Jeeps everywhere you look. You didn't know there were so many Jeeps on the road. Either that, or there's been just a wave of Jeep sales on the very same day that you bought yours. Well, it's not that. It's more that you're just primed to look for them. You see your Jeep, that puts Jeeps top of mind. And so now the other ones out there, they stand out in your field of view. This principle is called the availability heuristic. That which is most readily available to your mind, what comes to mind easily, you judge to be more prevalent, in the case of the Jeeps, more true and more legitimate. This principle is famously leveraged by Coca-Cola in several of their advertising slogans, like "Coke is it, ain't nothing like the real thing." Though, because they know that they're the market leader, they're the most available in the soda category, that you think of them as the real article and other versions as sort of knockoffs. Even if the others came before, the one that is most available is the one you think of as the true thing. And the availability heuristic also makes it seem that things are more common than they are. You ever notice that shark attacks go in waves? There'll be like none for a couple of years, and then there's a whole bunch all of a sudden, and then they kind of die down again. Is it due to the migration patterns of sharks? No. Shark attacks are basically level for all of human history, with a little bit of an increase once the automobile became a big deal and we all started going to the beach more. But what happens is a shark attack is a very attention-getting thing. And when it gets our attention, it also gets the attention of other people, like reporters and editors. Yes, they are people too. And so shark attacks are more available to them, just like you see more Jeeps. You start to spot more of those stories, and the editors and reporters do as well. And you'll have sort of a media glut of those stories. And then it plays itself out and they move on to the next thing. But this is the different ways in which the availability heuristic plays out in our lives. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that the availability heuristic sort of directs our attention for things that we're scanning for very quickly. And when we're talking about websites, we are in very quick territory. Something like 80% of people will judge the quality of your business based on the quality of your website. And let's all acknowledge there is no basis in truth for that judgment. You could have a great business and a lousy site, or a great site and a lousy business. Having one doesn't actually bear upon the quality of the other, but this is just the assumption that people make. That's why we have the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. We wouldn't need the saying except that everybody judges a book by its cover. And how fast does that judgment happen? Many people like to say in the blink of an eye. That is not true. The blink of an eye is 100 to around 145 milliseconds. People form a snap judgment of a website in 50 milliseconds. That is half the blink of an eye, or a third the blink of an eye. It's faster. So that's how important all of this is. Next slide. All right, while we're talking about the availability heuristic, I just want to make pause. I know it's partway through the morning. Are you thirsty? Would you like something tasty to drink? Maybe you should see if you can find something tasty to drink. Next slide. And next slide. Why did your eye jump to the Coke? There were 6 different pictures of random things, and your eye kind of scanned around and locked in on the Coke for a second. Well, thirst is a threat to your survival. And satisfying your thirst is good for your survival. The recognition that you have found a solution to a core problem gives you a pop of dopamine. Finding what you're looking for feels good. That dopamine is the brain's reward system for doing things that will keep you alive and extend the species. So, when you eat a cheeseburger, there are all these nutrients and all this energy that comes in. Your brain gets a flood of dopamine. Every time you find something you're looking for, you get another little hit. And that good feeling puts people in a positive emotional state. This is why Where's Waldo books are fun, right? You look and you look and you look and look and you eventually find it. Yay! They're delightful. Want to feel great? Let's see if we can find Waldo. Next slide. Hey, congratulations, you did it. Good job. Next. All right. As business people, everyone on this call knows that when you want a decision made, you go to the decision maker. You don't go to some committee down the hall. You want to speak to who's actually making the decision. Speak to the manager, not the review committee. Well, in your brain, that is very much the dynamic of how decisions get made. So next slide, please. This is your brain. Well, this is a brain. Brains are not color-coded, but this one is to make things easier for us. I'm going to walk you through how decisions get made in the brain. First, the front part of your brain, this pink area that sits behind your forehead, that's the prefrontal cortex. And that is like your heavy-duty supercomputer processing center. That's where all kinds of factors get weighed against one another. If you're considering a car, this is the part of your brain that is calculating mileage and resale value and seating and load capacity and towing capability, and like all of these heavily rational factors are evaluated in the prefrontal cortex, the part right behind your forehead. Then, after evaluating all those factors, basically that area writes a report and sends that report down to this sort of walnut thing hanging at the bottom in the center there. That's the cerebellum. And down in the cerebellum is where your decision switch is. It's sort of like a switch on train tracks, left or right, A or B, yes or no, up or down. It's a very simple mechanism. And basically the prefrontal cortex figures out all the factors, sends its recommendation for what decision should get made down to that switch where the decision gets made. And then after that decision is made, the sort of here's the decision we made report goes back up to the prefrontal cortex to be rechecked and reevaluated. And say, yes, that's why we made that decision. Good job. And then you explain to yourself why you did it and why it was good. Here's the thing, though. Down in the cerebellum, your decision switch has a roommate. And the roommate is your emotions. The emotions live down in the cerebellum. They're in the room with the decision maker, while the rational factors are way down the hall up in the prefrontal cortex. If you can influence the emotions, you have influence in the room where the decision's getting made. If you only influence intellectual factors, you're influencing the report writers and they're not in the room. Obviously, you want to be in the room where the decision gets made. Okay, this sounds good. How do you know it's true? Here's how you know it's true. You have run an experiment that shows this many times, or at least sometimes in your life, hopefully not too many. And that is if you've ever made a decision where you went, why did I do that? You thought about the factors. You knew what you were supposed to do. You knew what you meant to do. And then you did something different. Well, that's because the report got written up, sent down in there. The emotion said, resale value, mileage, who cares? I want the sports car. It feels great. It's red. And then that comes back up to the prefrontal cortex. It says, wait, this decision does not match our recommendation. What the heck? And when we get into a moment like that, if anyone's ever asked you, why did you make that decision? And you can't explain it, and you don't know why you did it, notice the language that we use in those moments. If I made a decision and somebody says, why did you do that? I would say, I don't know, it just felt right. It felt right. This isn't some approximation because we don't know how to describe what happened. This is actually a precise description of what happened. My emotions drove that decision, not my rationality. And that's why I say it felt right. So to tie the past couple of concepts together, remember that what is available to your mind is true and important. Finding what you're looking for feels good, and feelings drive decisions. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so Sales 101, make it about your customer. Anyone who's been in business for any length of time successfully knows if you make it about you, that's a very short trip. But if you make it about your customer, make it about other people, aside from just being good interpersonal skills, that's good business. You wouldn't allow someone on your team to just talk at people and not ask any questions. So why do so many businesses accept exactly that behavior from their website? Remember, this is your first impression. If one of your sales reps was creating a first impression of your business by just babbling nonstop at people and not hearing anything in return, you would immediately pull that person aside and they might not be a sales rep for very long. And yet this is what most business websites do. They talk and they don't ask. Sidebar, webcasts where I don't have people to interact with, super weird because I'm used to asking questions and having that back and forth. So I hope you're nodding along out there in digital world. Last principle, and before we get into deeper specifics on these, is on the next slide, cut. And that is get rid of everything that isn't the main job. And that goes back to the Gospel of Curly, do one thing, cut everything else that isn't that. Okay, so on the next slide, how do we do it? Those principles sound good, but they're kind of up here. How do we bring them down and get tactical with those principles to apply them to create a different kind of web experience? First, identify the business objectives that you need to achieve. 2, prioritize them. Get them in order. Because if you're trying to do everything, then you're not really doing anything. Then 3, Gospel of Curly, do one thing right. 4, ask what problem do we solve for people? And then once you understand that, don't present information, model behavior. And that I'm going to do some explaining around that in just a minute, because that one's a little opaque until you see what I mean by that. All right, let's move on to business objectives. First, focus. If you're investing in a tool, and a website's just a tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver, be clear about what returns you expect from that tool. What job do you expect that tool to do for you? If I have some thing sticking out of the floor, and I want it to not stick out of the floor anymore, all right, I know I want my tool to get that thing back in the floor. Now, maybe it needs to be a hammer, maybe it needs to be a screwdriver, pardon me, but I know what I want the tool to do. If you're not clear about what you want it to do, you won't really be able to tell when you've been successful, and you're unlikely to be successful in any case, because how can you make something suit a purpose if you don't know what that purpose is? This is about you and about your company, right? Thinking about what is important to us, what are we trying to achieve by building a website in the first place, and getting that really focused. That's about you. Next step, prioritize. If everything's important, nothing's important. And every business has a lot of different objectives in play at once, right? There is no business leader on earth who only has one thing to do. But because this is a tool, you want to make sure it is focused on one job, on doing one thing well. I often like to think about Swiss Army knives in this case. A Swiss Army knife is a wonderful thing. I still have the one that I got for my 10th birthday. Whenever I go camping, I bring it with me, because I've got a knife, I've got scissors, I've got a saw, I have all of these things, and they all fit in my pocket in one. That said, it's not a great knife. It's a kind of a terrible saw. It's barely functional scissors. So in terms of having an okay version, a barely acceptable version of all of the tools, well, that's fantastic. The convenience is really what that tool is for. But each of the components, right? Do you really want to saw something down with a saw that big? No, you want a saw this big. If you really need a saw, you want a saw that does one job, it saws. If you need to cut something, you want a good set of shears, not a little teeny tiny scissors like that. And many websites are built as Swiss Army knives when they really should be a focused thing that does one job, like a saw or a good pair of shears. So as you look at your business objectives, get them in order of, there are many things we need to do, but we want this website to do one of these things really well. Remember Amazon. They do one thing really well. Next slide. Gospel of Curly, yes, we covered that. Gave early amen. Again, this is still about you and your company, your business objectives, what you want to achieve. Next. Then ask, what problem do we solve as a company? Who has that problem? And what is their life like with that problem? How is that problem impacting their existence? And then lastly, what could their life be like without that problem? Now, this isn't about you. This is about your customer, right? You have to do a little bit of introspection on those first couple of steps, thinking about you and what's important to you and what you want to achieve, and being disciplined in your focus of what goal you're going to go after. But this is where you turn the telescope around and you start to look at things from your customer's perspective and say, what problem do they have? How do we solve it with whatever it is that we sell or the service we provide, et cetera? What's their life like, and what would their life be like if they didn't have the problem? And next, so carefully evaluate your current processes for solving that problem and helping people know that you've solved it. So whatever this business objective is that you've decided you want the site to address, you're already doing it somehow. Is it sales? Is it outreach? Is it relationship development? Whatever it is, you're already doing it somehow because you're in business. So then the question is, how could the site follow that pattern of behavior? And this is where tweaking this question, remember that question we brought up early on, the wrong way to go about this is, what should be on our site? And you start from there. Well, that puts the cart several zip codes ahead of the horse. The question you want to start with is, how are we successful in this business function regularly. Now, if you remember from the title, I said secrets to sales success. So we're going to look at this in a sales context, though you can easily extrapolate this to other kinds of business functions. How does sales work at your company? It works different ways, different places, but there's usually some kind of dialogue with a prospective customer. And there is a series of behaviors that you have honed over the months or years or decades, or in the case of certain organizations, centuries, to be successful in that sales. And so what we do with clients is actually, we get on either a Zoom call or in a room when we can actually be together, which is wonderful. And we role play it out. And we write down everything that happens and then clean that map up. And now I'm going to show you what that might look like. So in a sales conversation, let's go to the next slide. And this is really about serving the customer. After we've role played the conversation in all the different ways that it can go, we kind of trim away the loose ends and get to the core. And this is a good sort of sanitized example from some real clients that we've worked with, where we game out their sales process. And we've noticed that usually there's 1, 2, sometimes 3 problems that customers have, and their business solves that problem. So in different ways, but there's usually only a couple of problems. And that's a short interaction. It's important to remember the patterns of behavior that we're used to in interacting with each other. We start short and we get longer and deeper with more context. I mean, just think of the most basic conversation you could have. Hi, how are you? Fine, and you? Oh, I'm pretty good. Enjoying the weather? Yeah, I am. So, hey, what's going on with your business? Well, I'll tell you. Do you notice how each of those responses, as the conversation went back and forth, like it got longer and longer and longer? Hi, how are you? Pretty good, and you? I'm good, enjoying the weather. Each of those sentences gets longer and longer as we work our way into the conversation. And yet a website that has 25 to 50 options is basically starting the conversation with blah, 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 blah. No human conversation begins that way. It would be incredibly awkward and off-putting. So why should we allow that to happen when somebody's forming a first impression of us online? Instead, what we try and do is use a map like this to model the way the conversation goes in the real world. Oh, I got problem 1, 2, or 3. Okay, great. I know what section of our business to start to steer you towards. And one of the first things that I want to do once we've gone too far down that road, I want to make sure to be thoughtful of your time and thoughtful of my own time and the costs for both of us associated with that. A conversation that goes on too long and isn't going anywhere wastes both people's time, and time is money. And that doesn't help anyone. So we call it, these qualifiers that happen in real conversations. If somebody comes into your store, hey, how can I help you today? All right, very general qualifying moment. And say you have a hardware store. They walk in and say, I'm looking for sneakers. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't sell those. Right? You've just told the person you might as well turn around and leave. Which, who wants to tell people to leave? Well, actually everybody, because if you don't sell what they have, them pacing the aisles, it doesn't really help them and it doesn't help you. Better to let them know that they should go somewhere else. And if you can tell them where to go, so much the better, because now you've helped them twice. Once you've been thoughtful about their time and you've saved them some time. So you did them a solid there. And if you can recommend the right place to go, even better. Now, when they do need what you sell, or someone else they know needs what you sell, they'll be more likely to recommend you or refer them to you because you had a good interaction based on a respectful, thoughtful relationship. But if they pass the qualifier, if you, in the hardware store example, I need roofing nails, great, let me take you over this way. As soon that qualifier, we call that a get in, get out moment, where they're in the sales cycle for real, which is good for you and good for them because you can start to move them quickly to where they need to be, or get out again, which is better for both parties. Whatever the response to the qualifier is, that usually tells you pretty either exactly what they need or 1 degree away from exactly what they need. Once they've passed that moment, you're very close to, oh, here's my recommendation for you. So once you've mapped out the way the conversation goes, then the question to ask is not what goes on our website, but how do we create an artifact, a thing, the website, that models this behavior? Knowing that we want this to be what the interaction feels like for the other person, because that's how we're successful when we do it normally. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a few examples of how this plays out in the real world, some sites that we've done before, and then we can just have some conversation at the end. So next slide. This is a website for River Oaks Baptist School in Houston, Texas. This is a site that we did using that idea that nobody cares about your school. They care about their child. And so on this site, whether you scroll up into the header navigation or you scroll down, you are invited to choose something. And next slide. This shows you the header navigation. If the user scrolls down, they're basically confronted with the same set of choices. Now, this is a K-8 school. And so this header nav is the qualifier, because if your child is going into high school, they don't offer that. And so if for some reason you ended up looking at the school thinking they had high school and they don't, this just saved you 30 minutes of digging around through a site, or 5. Either way. It lets you know exactly what their offerings are, so you can get out if it's not relevant to you, or get in if it is. And specifically, if your child is going to, let's say, kindergarten, well, kindergarten's really on your mind. That's available. If you were to looking around, places that advertise school might pop up in your attention. Places that advertise kindergarten would rise. You would immediately lock onto those, just like you notice all the other Jeeps in the road, on the road. Next slide. So here is a kindergarten page. This is a PDF, so we can't scroll down. But if we did, what you would see is a block for English, a block for math and science and foreign languages and arts and athletics and all these things that let you dig into a page that is really rich and concrete in terms of what your child's experience will be in that area of interest. Because even, like I said earlier, even if you have several children, there's one that maybe say, maybe we should look and see what else there could be. And in that case, if especially for private schools, which are a very expensive thing to buy, right? A private school tuition is like buying a new car every year for every kid that you have enrolled there. If you have 3 kids, that's the equivalent of buying 3 cars every year. It's a big deal. And if you're going to ask somebody to spend that kind of money, you should be able to give them a very good answer, a straight answer, quickly, about what they're going to get. So if their child's going into kindergarten, kindergarten's on your mind. And what does the child care about? Well, there's the whole menu of things that the kid might be interested in. She loves art. If you go on the art page, now you're 2 clicks in and you're already able to read about and imagine your child's experience in art class in kindergarten next year at this school. And the more you start to imagine the future on the other side of the purchase decision, whether it's school or hammers or sneakers, the more you imagine that future, the more you begin to feel that it already belongs to you. We don't have time to go into the psychology of the endowment effect, but suffice it to say that the more you imagine that kind of thing, the higher its evaluation in your mind and the lower your price sensitivity. So all kinds of sales benefits accrue to stoking that kind of imagining in your customers. Next slide. Oh, and this is sort of, I think this chart is from Moses Brown, not from Rob's, but these are the results that we typically see when we implement that model for a school. Every school's pattern of admissions interest is sort of this double humped camel, where in September, October, they get a ton of interest, they have their open house, etc. November, December, it drops way off as people get busy with the holidays, and then it pops back up, though not as quite as high in January. And historical data from every school we've ever worked with follows the same pattern. But when you make it about the child, you see this 8x bump in traffic to the inquiry page. Next slide. So this is, getting away from schools. This is a chemical manufacturer, wildly different industry, and yet the same principles hold true. Now this is heavy industrial B2B. You couldn't be farther from like retail and things like that. But when we sat down with them, and they had never received a single lead through their website, we asked, all right, well, how do you want people to ask for samples because that's how you make a sale? Okay, well, how does that happen now? And they said, well, they talk to our lead chemist. Okay, and how does that conversation go? And then we did exactly the exercise that you saw the result of earlier with flow charting the conversation. And as we worked through that conversation, we began to understand that there are certain questions that are really important, some that are kind of secondary or tertiary, and then we built an interface that asked those kinds of questions. Again, like you would never tolerate a sales rep that just talks at people and says, here's what we offer, and never asks what their problem is or what they need. So we built an interface that asks what they need and what their problem is. Next slide. So this is a product selector. This is heavy industrial B2B, so they like a simpler, cleaner approach to design, not a lot of bells and whistles and emotional communication, but they do want to be direct. And the questions that they ask, they're like, well, what's the pH? What's the water percentage of your finished product that you're going into? Are you making a shampoo or a lotion? And do you need a cost-effective conventional or a more expensive all-natural thing because you're going to be selling this at Whole Foods and it's got to be just so? And then there are a few other questions, does it need to be non-GMO? Some other stuff like that, like I said, are secondary or tertiary concerns. As you move these controls, basically the search results that you're seeing, the different blocks here, they filter down where from their dozens and dozens of SKUs, by the time you've moved a couple of these controls, you're only looking at 2 or 3 items. Next slide. You pick one, and now it gives you full details. And if you were to scroll down, you would see a lot the other kinds of things that people need to know when they're considering one of these ingredients for a finished formulation. But again, this is patterned exactly on the behavior of the real world sales reps rather than what should we put on our site. And then one final example for you, Berkeley College of Music. This is a new version of the site from when I worked on it, but I've got it there to share an experience that I think is helpful. Berkeley has really no class culture in the way that most colleges do. You went to URI, class of 01, woo woo. There's none of that at Berkeley. And for the reason that for the first 40 or 50 years of Berkeley's existence, if you were really good, you never graduated because somebody would pick you up and take you on tour and you just start working. So you never finished your education. Now that has changed and people now recognize the value of completing the program. And so it's become a little more traditional in that way. And yet they've never developed a culture of class identity. We're the class of 01, we're the class of 02. And having a disconnected alumni base, one, it means they don't have the value of community that they can get from each other and continuing their friendships. And obviously, this has a pretty big effect on your ability to fundraise. So to create enough cohesion that you can springboard off of that into fundraising, we needed to find a way to bring alumni back together. And we knew it wasn't going to be in these traditional sort of year-based things. But what we realized they need all the time, the conversations that are going on constantly, is the churn of musicians rotating in and out of bands. Somebody's bass player just got hired away by the Rolling Stones to go on tour for 18 months, and now they have no bass player. So this was in 2004. I built one of the world's first social networks. MySpace was up earlier, but this was before Facebook, before Twitter, a social network just for musicians to be able to connect with the players that they need. So we, again, that empathy idea of thinking about what problem do they have? What's their life like with it? What could it be like without it? Well, we created a platform where they could easily connect and find bandmates, even on the road. If somebody got sick and you've got a gig that night, what are you going to do about it? Well, they'd be able to find Berkeley credentialed, let's say, drummers in Topeka for today to be able to get somebody in that chair so they could put the show on that they were contracted to do. Next slide. This is Leo Tolstoy, who has a famous saying that all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The Tolstoy principle of websites, which he definitely did not intend to apply to websites, but I will, is that all bad websites are bad in the same way, and that is that they are all talking and no asking, which, of course, as we've discussed, leads to, next slide, sorrow, sad customers. However, if you can insist that your website behave like a great sales rep and ask good questions and be thoughtful and considerate, and apply that thoughtful consideration at every level of the site, at its structure, at the arrangement of the interface, the graphic design, the copy that you write, even the images that are shared, that they're illustrative and not duplicative, and in the follow-up workflow that happens after someone takes action. Well, then that leads to happy customers, our favorite kind. And so now what? What do you do with this information? Well, straightforward. Next slide. Ask good questions. Make it about the customer, not about you. Remember that less really is more. And if you need help, get help. And next slide. If you need to get help, I'm happy to help out. We generally reserve Fridays for consulting appointments, and I have 3 openings over the next 2 weeks. First come, first serve. Just go ahead and email me at that address, and a complimentary consulting appointment. These are 30-minute slots, and I'll just give them out until they're gone. And then one additional offer that I'll make for folks who are on the call with us is, obviously, a great website is expensive. You know, a highly interactive one can be $100,000, and a straightforward one with custom photography and copywriting can be $20,000. These are not insignificant amounts. So anybody who's on the call, if you email me and reference the call, we'll just take 15% off of whatever the project ends up being. And that's my gift to you on this day, and I'm happy to take questions.
Adam, that was amazing. I loved it, and we got a lot of wonderful comments, people chiming in. They love the Swiss Army knife analogy in terms of the the diagram that you had presented in terms of mapping out exactly how an interaction might go. What a clear way to parse out the decision-making process. Jennifer says consulting appointments, they are hugely valuable. Adam is a great and full of insights. So that was really nice of you to, of course, open up your calendar to do some consult, and also to provide a bit of a favorable treatment to chamber members, which we love. So let me just ask you a couple of questions, Adam, based on some of the things that you put out there, which, of course, was fantastic. And it is amazing how frequently sometimes you can just skip over the most important thing, which is what does the customer want, and what is the customer thinking, and what pain point, if you will, you are solving for the customer that is visiting your website. So that's always great to remind people that it's not about them, it's really about the customer. And that's something that you can't say enough times over and over again. Question about colors and fonts. Are there certain, you talk about, how do we want people to feel, and the dopamine rush of, finding what they want. How do those 2 factors play into this?
Fonts and colors. So are there best fonts and colors? The answer is yes, there are best fonts and colors. What are they?
Tell us.
It depends. Well, what does it depend on? That's, what kind of non-answer is that, Adam? It's not a non-answer. It's the honest answer, because the fonts and colors that are right really go back to when I talked about the 3-step process. We start with brand, look at business objectives, and then get to creative. Excuse me, what that brand essence is going to determine the outcome of all kinds of different decisions. Some of them will be design decisions like fonts and colors. If you have a brand that is very reserved and it's about, let's say it's an engineering company that is focused on mathematical excellence and extreme precision, that's a colder feel. And that's going to start to lean you towards cooler color palettes, more sans serif fonts. Think about the lean, clean minimalism of Scandinavian design and IKEA and all that kind of thing. If your brand is more about warmth and human connection, well, you might want serifed fonts that tend to feel a little bit warmer and a color palette that skews more to the warm end of the spectrum. The importance of brand isn't just about fonts and colors, though. It really comes down to even strategic decisions about what to do with your business. When your brand is in focus, those decisions become better. A classic example, Southwest Airlines has a famously flat corporate culture in that they're willing to take a good idea from anywhere. Anyone can contribute. And a number of years back, a flight attendant had the idea, hey, nobody likes lousy airline food. What if we served better food? Well, yeah, who doesn't want better food on a flight? That's a great idea. And it had enough merit that next thing you know, that flight attendant found herself in the boardroom with the CEO and the entire board of Southwest Airlines, considering completely changing their in-flight service to have premium meals. And they went around, they went back and forth, and they talked cost, and they talked value, and they talked perception. And the CEO had one of those CEO moments where he said, wait a minute, our brand is the low-cost airline. Does this get us closer to or farther from being the low-cost airline? Well, great meals are a little more expensive. You're not the low-cost airline. So that idea is great, but not right for you. And that's a situation where a business decision becomes much easier to make when you understand what the brand is. So that drives fonts and colors. There is a second piece, especially to color, that's worth noting, and that is around accessibility. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to websites just like it applies to buildings and physical infrastructure. When we design a website, we run everything through some software that helps us see how the color palettes we've designed work for different kinds of color blindness. Because there's more than one kind. They can look wildly different. And, if, say, your link color doesn't stand out for a person with a certain kind of color blindness, it means they can't find what to click on your site. So it is important to do those kinds of reviews. And obviously, it's the right thing to do. There is also a powerful self-interest case in people being able to use your website. And there are a number of law firms around the country who have made a practice of just going to websites to see if they're accessible, and if not, suing the business owner under the ADA for noncompliance. And then, of course, everybody settles. They are able to make their money and move on. But it's sort of an expensive and painful lesson. There's a platform that we use called Accessibee. It's $400 or $500 a year for your site. It's very easy to install. Every site that we build, we include that as part of the package so that people are protected on those accessibility concerns.
Great answer. And who knew, right? Who knew? Another question about e-commerce sites and, trying to balance what you said about, one thing, and Amazon focuses on one thing, and that's selling stuff. So what if your website is an e-commerce site that sells commodity type items, if you will? Is it better to focus in on a narrow niche or to throw the whole kitchen sink at it?
I think I need a little more context to fully understand the question, but I'm going to just take a wild swing at it. One, if it's, hey, selling stuff is one thing. So, and that's the Amazon approach, right? You know, you can buy sneakers, a new water heater, a transmission, shoelaces, whatever. It's just buying things. And Amazon has chosen to make that its one thing. If you offer different, you know, you sell a bunch of sneakers and also some hats and a few t-shirts, there can be value in narrowing your focus online. It doesn't mean you have to, but that is one way to apply focus. Again, with a little more context, I could probably give a better answer.
Yeah. So I was just following up on the idea that, you know, you don't want to frustrate the customer with too much stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, less is more, but how much less is better?
Well, and part of it is in how you guide the customer through your offerings. So if you think back to the school example that we showed, the Houston school, where there are, you know, there's the preschool grades, the lower school grades, and the middle school grades. Each grade has 15 subject areas or so on it. When you multiply that out, that's a couple of 100 pages of content. That would be way overwhelming for a user. But because we've modeled the site structure on the kind of conversation you would have, you never see all those pages. You only see kindergarten and the limited selection of content that's relevant to you. So that's when, you know, by shifting the way you think of it from what should be on our site to how does the interaction go and how can we make the site model that interaction, then what you discover is that as human beings, when we talk to each other, we have great ways of filtering out efficiently, you know, the 99.9% of everything that isn't relevant to our conversation right now. And so when you make this site follow those patterns of behavior, then you're able to have, you know, 5,000 SKUs and still have an elegant user experience.
I was fascinated by the manufacturing site that you presented, with the front page shot being of an elegant woman, if you will. What was thinking that went into that? It seems counterintuitive, but I guess that's the point, right?
Well, yeah. The one mantra that I live by is fewer pictures bigger. A big picture, your eye will soak it in. When there are a lot of little pictures, oftentimes your eye kind of glazes over it and skims them, but doesn't dig into any one. Because they're basically the customers for that company are L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, these big beauty companies that are, the way they market to their customers is, you know, always pictures of beautiful people doing beautiful things, living wonderful lives. That's sort of the emotional territory that those buyers are in. That's the world that they inhabit when they think about their customers. So we wanted to make sure that the front page of this site sort of met them where they are psychologically, and then moved them into this more industrial place to get the job done. But starting by showing visually, hey, we speak your language, we know what you're trying to accomplish, and then move them over into the more transactional aspect.
Are men and women equally emotional as buyers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no gender difference in the way emotions inform decisions. This is brain structure. It's the way the brain is built, like where the parts are.
Are there any differences?
Are there any differences? I mean, there are as many differences as there are kinds of people. And actually, what you'll find more is differences between different psychology profiles rather than breaking down along any demographic lines.
I didn't hear you mention video, although we did talk about filmmaking and
Sure.
But you didn't address the notion of, you know, should there be a bunch of videos on the site?
So video is great. I mean, the question is, what job do you want that video to do? Or what job do you want the site to do? How can video help you do it? Video is amazing. And really, there's no other tool as effective at getting someone to believe something in a deep way. You know, our minds have amazing defenses. We have this wall that protects us against anyone trying to tell us what to do or think or feel. If we, instead of being online, if we were all sitting at a table and someone joined us and said, that he was the smartest person we'd ever met, we'd all kind of roll our eyes and be like, get a load of this guy. But if we're at that same table, hanging out, having a conversation, the same person sits down, and in the course of conversation, a topic comes up, and he were to say, oh, this reminds me of a conversation I had at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I was speaking with the Dalai Lama and a couple of Nobel Prize winning economists, and what they had to say was, we would all sort of look at each other and think, holy smokes, this person's really smart, right? Because we were taking the evidence and putting it together ourselves. And that's what video allows you to do. Or video thought approached as a filmmaker rather than, hey, let's just make a video in which a person tries to tell you we're the best, or we've been around, and because we're quality, blah, blah, I'm telling you we're quality. But you're not going to accept that from me. If I put the evidence in front of you that shows quality, you'll put those pieces together. And once you've put them together and come to your own conclusion, that becomes nearly unshakable. And that's why making a great video starts with script and focusing on script before you get anywhere near a camera. That's sort of a separate, we can do a webinar just on video and dig into that in detail if you need to.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you're saying is, these investments are not to be taken lightly, and it's part of an overall strategy. And it's, these decisions shouldn't be made on a one-off basis, that all of the pieces kind of flow into each other, and it takes strategy, right? It takes strategy. What, just one last question as we, end our time together. I'm wondering what you're predicting and what you're seeing from a trend perspective in terms of people wanting to, have more of a digital presence in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Before I answer that, there's one thing I want to circle back to that you mentioned that was really important, and that was talking about pain points and understanding what the customer's pain points are and addressing them. Hugely important, obviously. However, there's another model that is also worth considering, and that is pleasure points. And I learned about the concept of pleasure buyers versus pain buyers from this sales guru, Jeff Hoffman. I think his website is sellhoffman.com. He does like a free webinar every Tuesday. I've learned a ton. So I'll share that because it's a place that I go to learn some things like this. And that is that pain point buyers have one set of concerns that they need to check off. Pleasure buyers are in a totally different mindset, and their buying process is much more about fulfilling a kind of personal narrative or corporate narrative. We see ourselves as the kind of company that, or I see myself as the kind of person who, and they need to be spoken to in a very, very different way. Oftentimes, a website will need to take into account both modes, and we sometimes will map out different kinds of conversations that happen when you get the sense that you're talking to one kind of person or another, that their frame of mind is here or there. You're going to ask a different set of questions. And so it's worth keeping that in mind, that it's not all about pain points. Oftentimes it is, but sometimes it's about this sort of a different kind of journey. I just want to make sure that we didn't overly narrow the focus there. And your question was trends. I am careful about predicting things. It's an easy way to be wrong. But I think it's pretty obvious there's a lot that is not going to go back from this past year has changed a lot of things permanently. How much business travel is really needed? The old joke of this could have been an email. Wow, we found out a lot of things could actually have been an email, and now they are. And that's a lot better. As you can see, I am not in the office, but I am in the alternate headquarters of Rustle Spark, which is at home. And a lot of people have found that that's a perfectly fine way to do business. And they like getting to have lunch with their kids during the summer and, see their spouse and not be stuck in a commute. Though all of those things are combining to make our digital tools a more important representation of the things that we do and the ways we interact.
Extremely well said. And Amy wants to see you do another session on video. So we will have to have you back, Adam, to continue
Be happy to.
the conversation. This has been fantastic. And really appreciate, the thoughtfulness that you put into presenting this all-inclusive, thought-provoking presentation. And, it wasn't, it wasn't a quick little manual on A, B, and C. It was really a masterclass on how the brain really is responsible for the emotional decisions behind what drives our businesses and what the consequences are for that. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. I know I did, and you've been terrific. Adam,
thank you so much, Laurie. So have you.
So will you come back and visit with us again in a couple of months? You could be on our Chamber TV favorites list. We have quite a few folks who really have established a rapport with our listeners, our viewers, because they're presenting, stuff that's a little bit off the beaten track, if you will, where you have to think, and it affects people, personally, as opposed to, maybe the nuts and bolts things that we have to deal with during the course of the rest of the day. So
I would be delighted.
I hope you will come back. Okay. All right. So we've been chatting with Adam Olenn from Rustle Spark, and Rustle Spark are not the names of people, It's meant to evoke a feeling, which is what we talked about today. And I thank you, Adam, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.